Tool is being unleashed in Florida's Everglades to hunt Burmese pythons. All right, take a look at this right here. Scientists have deployed 120 robot rabbits.
Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades. Now, as Wink News reporter Bridget Bruchowski explains, researchers turn to tech, hoping robotic rabbits can lure the snakes out.
Florida's python problem has always felt like something pulled from a creature feature script. A swamp the size of a small country, predators that don't belong there, and a slow-motion collapse of native wildlife that most people never see because it happens under sawgrass and moonlight. So when word spread that the state had turned to robotic rabbits to help kill pythons, it landed with the kind of disbelief that makes you blink at your phone twice. A rabbit that isn't alive, hopping into a wetland where snakes can grow longer than a car, sounds like a gimmick until you remember what the Everglades has become. An ecological chessboard where the usual moves stopped working years ago. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The premise is simple enough to explain and unsettling enough to stick in your head. Invasive pythons thrive because they're stealthy, patient, and perfectly suited to ambush. They don't need to chase, they just need to be in the right place at the right time. That makes them maddeningly difficult to locate with humans alone. Even trained hunters with dogs and years of experience can walk within yards of a large python and never know it's there. In a landscape of water, mud, and dense vegetation, detection is the hardest part of control. If you can't reliably find the predator, every other plan becomes a guessing game. That's where the robotic rabbit idea makes a certain cold sense. Pythons are not roaming around looking for trouble. They're waiting for a meal. If you can create a meal-shaped signal that is more obvious than anything the swamp provides naturally, you can flip the usual search problem on its head. Instead of people hunting for snakes, the snakes reveal themselves by responding to a lure. The rabbit isn't meant to fight. It's meant to tempt, to broadcast movement and heat cues, to stand out just enough from the chaos of reeds and shadows that a python's instincts do the rest. A robotic rabbit, in this context, isn't a cute toy with cartoon eyes. Think of it as a field device dressed in the silhouette of prey, engineered to trigger the sensory shortcuts that predators rely on. Movement matters, but so does temperature. Many snakes can detect heat differences with remarkable sensitivity, and their hunting behavior is wired to interpret those cues as a warm-bodied animal. Add subtle motion patterns that mimic a nervous, foraging mammal, and you've built something like a trap that persuades the target to come to you rather than forcing you to comb miles of swamp, hoping to catch a glimpse of scales. The state's interest in tools like this is rooted in a brutal reality. The python invasion has likely already reshaped parts of the ecosystem. In places where pythons have established, studies and field reports have described steep declines in small mammals, wading birds, and other species that used to be common. That loss doesn't just mean fewer animals for tourists to spot. It alters seed dispersal, changes predator-prey relationships, and can ripple out into water quality and vegetation patterns. When a top invasive predator settles in, it doesn't politely take a small slice of the food web. It grabs the steering wheel. Traditional python control has leaned on several strategies, each with drawbacks. Organized hunts can remove snakes, but they're labor-intensive and uneven. Detector dogs can help, but they require training and can't cover everything. Radio tagging can be used on captured males to locate breeding females during mating season, but that depends on catching a lead snake first. Thermal drones can spot heat signatures in open areas, but vegetation can mask them and flight time is limited. Every method works sometimes and fails often enough to keep the overall population stubbornly resilient. Against that backdrop, a robotic lure is less a flashy novelty and more an attempt to solve the one problem that keeps winning: finding the python before the python finds something else to eat. The kill part of the robotic rabbit concept is where the ethics and the engineering collide. A lure can bring a python close, but what happens next has to be precise. If the system is designed to guide hunters to a location, then the rabbit is essentially a beacon and a bait rolled into one. If it is designed as an integrated trapping device, then it needs to account for strength, size variation, and safety. Pythons can be enormous and they're not delicate. Any mechanism that relies on the snake behaving in a narrow, predictable way risks failure. Worse, a poorly designed trap could harm non-target wildlife. In a place already stressed by invasive species and human development, the last thing you want is a new tool that becomes a new hazard. That risk of non-target impact is one of the biggest implications of deploying prey-mimicking robots in the wild. Rabbits and rodents aren't only interesting to pythons. Bobcats, foxes, alligators, raptors, and even opportunistic birds could investigate something that moves like food. The Everglades is full of hungry animals that have learned to be curious. A robotic rabbit has to be engineered not just to attract the target, but to survive attention from everything else or to minimize it. That means materials that resist chewing, waterproofing that can take submersion, and fail-safes that prevent a curious animal from being injured by moving parts or snagged components. It's not enough for the robot to work. It has to coexist with an ecosystem that doesn't care what your prototype is supposed to do. Then there's the question of behavioral conditioning. When technology enters a landscape, it can change animal behavior in ways that aren't obvious at first. If predators repeatedly encounter robotic prey, will they learn to avoid it? Will they become more cautious around movement cues, making them harder to catch later? Or could the opposite happen, where certain animals start associating these devices with easy meals and begin seeking them out? Even a small shift in behavior can matter when you're dealing with invasive predators and native species already under pressure. A control tool should ideally reduce harm without rewriting the rules for everything else. The use of robotics also signals a bigger shift in how wildlife management is evolving. From manpower-heavy approaches to sensor-driven, networked systems. A robotic rabbit can be more than a moving decoy. It can be a data platform. If it includes cameras, thermal sensors, motion detection, or proximity triggers, it could record interactions, map activity patterns, and help biologists understand where pythons concentrate and when they're most active. That turns each deployment into a mini field study. Over time, those data could refine where to place traps, how to time removal efforts, and which habitats serve as corridors for spread. The implication is that control becomes less like random searching and more like guided precision. But that data angle comes with another set of complications: cost, maintenance, and accountability. Wetlands are brutal environments for electronics. Heat, humidity, insects, salt, intrusion in coastal areas, and sudden storms can ruin equipment quickly. Devices will fail, batteries will die, GPS can drift under canopy, motors can jam with mud. If the state invests heavily in a fleet of robotic lures, it also has to invest in the unglamorous work of retrieval, repair, and replacement. Otherwise, the landscape could end up littered with dead devices, turning an anti-invasive project into an unintended pollution problem. There's also the public perception factor, which matters more than people like to admit. Wildlife policy lives and dies not just by ecology, but by trust. Some residents will cheer any aggressive tactic that reduces an invasive predator. Others will worry that the state is turning nature into a testing ground for surveillance gadgets or militarized pest control. A robotic rabbit is an easy image to sensationalize because it's weird in a very visual way. That can be useful for awareness, but dangerous for nuance. If the public conversation gets stuck on the novelty, it can drown out the real stakes: biodiversity loss, long-term management budgets, and the limits of any single intervention. And the stakes are genuinely high. Pythons reproduce effectively, can travel through waterways, and don't face many natural checks in Florida. Even a tool that improves detection and removal won't erase them overnight. The goal in invasive species management is often containment and suppression, not total elimination, especially once an invasive animal has spread widely. That means success looks like fewer pythons in sensitive areas, reduced predation pressure on native wildlife, and preventing expansion into new regions. A robotic rabbit doesn't change that reality. It's a tactic, not a miracle. The implication is that Florida is searching for incremental advantages, small edges that, combined, can keep the ecosystem from sliding further. The technology also raises uncomfortable questions about how humans choose winners and losers in ecosystems. The python is invasive, and controlling it is widely seen as necessary to protect native species. but the method of control still matters. Using lifelike decoys to lure an animal into capture is a deliberate manipulation of instinct. Some people will see it as smart and humane compared to other options. Others will see it as a slippery slope toward treating wildlife like pests to be engineered away. That debate isn't just philosophical, it shapes what agencies can fund, what lawmakers will support, and how communities respond when new tools are proposed. If Florida's managers are willing to deploy robotic prey, it also suggests a broader openness to creative, hybrid approaches, pairing biology with engineering. That could accelerate a whole class of conservation technologies. Imagine integrated systems where lures communicate with drones, where thermal scans confirm targets, where field teams receive real-time alerts, and where machine learning filters false positives. The robotic rabbit becomes a symbol of a future where conservation isn't only boots in the mud, but networks, sensors, and autonomous platforms designed for ecological outcomes. That future could make management more effective, but it could also create dependence on proprietary tech, contractors, and budgets that fluctuate with politics. Another implication is scalability. If a robotic lure proves useful, it invites the question, can it be mass-produced and deployed at the scale the Everglades demands? Scaling in a lab is easy. Scaling in a swamp is not. You need training for staff, protocols for placement, guidelines for minimizing disturbance, and plans for storms and flooding. You also need a strategy for where these devices go because putting them everywhere isn't just expensive, it could disrupt wildlife patterns or concentrate predators in unintended places. A smart deployment would be targeted, informed by habitat features, historical sightings, and seasonal movement patterns. That requires coordination across agencies, researchers, and field crews, not just purchasing hardware. There's a security dimension too. Any valuable device placed in public access wilderness can be stolen, vandalized, or tampered with. If the robot includes sensors or cameras, tampering could also raise privacy concerns, even if the intent is wildlife monitoring. Agencies would need clear rules about what is recorded, how it's stored, and who can access it. Otherwise, the narrative can spiral. A conservation device becomes, in the public imagination, a surveillance rabbit hiding in the brush. The technology might be focused on snakes, but the social implications land on humans. The robotic rabbit concept also highlights something that's easy to miss. Florida's invasive species challenges aren't limited to one animal. The state deals with the revolving door of invasives, plants, fish, reptiles, insects, because of climate, trade, and accidental or intentional releases. Investing in adaptable technology could create a toolkit for multiple threats. A lure platform designed for pythons might inspire similar systems for other species, like aquatic invasives that respond to sound or light cues. The implication is that Florida may be experimenting not just with a one-off gadget, but with a new paradigm for rapid response. At the same time, it's worth remembering that technology can distract from prevention. The python problem exists because of human activity, the pet trade, releases, and a lack of early containment. When a crisis becomes entrenched, the solutions become expensive and dramatic. Robotic rabbits are dramatic. They can make it feel like science fiction has arrived to rescue the swamp. But the quieter, more effective work, tightening regulations, improving pet ownership accountability, investing in public education, and funding early detection often gets less attention because it isn't flashy. The implication here is a caution. Innovation is valuable, but it shouldn't become an excuse to ignore the policies that prevent the next invasion. There's also a deeper ecological implication in how pythons are framed. They are often treated as villains, and in the context of Florida's native ecosystems, their impact is unquestionably harmful. Yet they are still animals following instincts. Any management strategy that relies on tricking those instincts has to be designed carefully to avoid needless suffering and collateral damage. If robotic lures help increase capture efficiency, they could reduce the time pythons spend preying on native wildlife, which is a net ecological benefit. But the ethical bar remains. Control should be effective, targeted, and as humane as realistically possible. The most interesting thing about the robotic rabbit story, stripped of hype, is what it reveals about desperation and ingenuity meeting in the middle. Florida is confronting a problem too big for simple fixes and too visible to ignore. When ecosystems tip, management gets creative. Robotics in the marsh isn't just a gimmick, it's a sign that conservation is entering an era where engineered behavior cues may become as common as traps and tags. That shift could unlock new capabilities, but it will also force new debates about how far we should go in shaping wild spaces with machines. Another implication sits in the background, like a low hum. Once you introduce lifelike machines into a living system, you start creating a new category of object that animals must interpret. Wild creatures already navigate a world full of human leftovers. Fishing line, plastic bottles, bait stations, trail cameras, airboats, and many of those objects change the odds of survival in subtle ways. A robotic lure is different because it behaves. Behavior is what animals read first, and it's what makes the device powerful, but it's also what makes it complicated. A moving object can pull attention, redirect travel routes, and concentrate activity in spots that weren't previously focal points. Even if the intention is controlled, the landscape itself may respond by shifting where predators and prey spend their time. That shift matters because the Everglades isn't a single uniform swamp. It's a mosaic of microhabitats stitched together by water levels that rise and fall. A tool that works in one patch of sawgrass might be less effective in mangroves, hardwood hammocks, canals, or edges near development where animals have different pressures and different habits. When an intervention is deployed across such varied terrain, it stops being one experiment and becomes many experiments happening simultaneously. Each place adds its own variables: clarity of water, density of vegetation, presence of alligators, human noise, seasonal prey availability. The device can't negotiate all those variables on its own, which means management has to become more adaptive and less one-size-fits-all. There's also an almost psychological layer for the humans involved. When agencies invest in technology, the temptation is to treat it like a solution rather than a tool. That can change funding priorities and field expectations. If people start believing a robotic lure handles the detection problem, other essential work can get quietly deprioritized. Habitat restoration, public reporting systems, training and retention for skilled removal teams, and long-term monitoring. The danger isn't that technology is bad, it's that it can make complex problems feel simpler than they are, which is how complacency sneaks in. Invasive control punishes complacency faster than almost anything else, because the organism on the other side keeps reproducing whether the budget meeting went well or not. At the same time, robotics can bring an unexpected discipline to decision-making. When you have devices in the field generating consistent streams of observations, you can start measuring effort and results with more clarity. Instead of relying mainly on opportunistic captures and scattered sightings, you can map interaction rates, assess which environments produce the most contacts, and identify corridors where snakes are likely moving. That opens the door to making management decisions less reactive. It can also make the program easier to justify to taxpayers and policymakers, because it's built on trackable indicators rather than anecdotes. In conservation, being able to prove what worked often determines whether anything continues long enough to matter. A more uncomfortable implication is what happens if the approach becomes a spectacle. When control measures turn into headline-friendly narratives, there's a risk that the public starts engaging with the issue as entertainment. That sounds harmless until you realize it can warp priorities. Agencies can feel pressure to pursue ideas that photograph well rather than ideas that quietly deliver results. The Python crisis deserves attention, but attention can be fickle and it can demand novelty. If the conversation becomes an endless chase for the next shocking tactic, the most effective measures, often repetitive, methodical, and boring, can get starved of resources. The ecosystem doesn't benefit from drama, it benefits from sustained, unglamorous effort. There's another angle that sits at the intersection of ecology and economics. Control is expensive not only because the environment is vast, but because the work needs continuity. If a program starts and stops, populations rebound. If a fleet of devices is deployed and then neglected, it becomes sunk cost without lasting impact. That reality tends to push agencies toward approaches that can be maintained year after year, even when leadership changes. Robotic lures, if they are to be part of that sustained approach, would have to be designed for durability and for operational simplicity. A tool that requires constant specialist attention can collapse the moment budgets tighten. A tool that field crews can deploy and maintain with minimal fuss has a better chance of becoming a stable part of the long-term strategy. The broader implication, though, is that Florida is experimenting with a kind of ecological persuasion, using the animal's own decision-making process as the lever. That's a different mindset from brute force removal alone. It treats invasive control as a problem of incentives and cues. What does the python perceive? What does it want? What triggers it to move? And how can that movement be predicted or directed? When management starts thinking in those terms, it can reshape everything from where traps are placed to when teams operate to how habitats are prioritized. It's a more behavioral view of the battlefield, and it aligns with the reality that pythons are hard to beat because they are so good at doing very little until the moment it matters. Finally, there's a symbolic implication that lingers even for people who never set foot in the Everglades. The idea of deploying robotic animals to protect real ones is a snapshot of our era. Biodiversity under pressure, ecosystems altered by global movement, and humans using increasingly sophisticated tools to patch the consequences of older mistakes. It's hopeful in one sense, ingenuity aimed at protection, but it's also sobering. The fact that such a tactic even seems reasonable is a sign of how extreme the situation has become, and how far we've drifted from the simpler goal of not letting invasive crises take root in the first place. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on releasing robotic rabbits against pythons? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.